kids, and welcome to Yellow Concrete. It's another podcast from me, Graham. Welcome. How are you? Good? Life, treating you well and whatnot? I hope so, That's all we can hope for, I imagine, within, the mortal realm. Today, it's going to be a little different. I'm going to start with a little story. Recently, I went on holiday. First time I've been on holiday in a while, I think. First time I've been on holiday outside of the United Kingdom in a while. Up to that point, it'd been a while since I've been out of the country. I think last year I didn't go out of the country because it was kind of like a financial saving year, so I did more camping within the UK and visiting UK destinations, because you don't have to leave the country to have a holiday. I think that's something which a lot of people don't really get, is that you can go see and relax. There is places within the UK that you can go see and relax, and it's interesting, and it's the hard reboot, which is what a holiday's for. I think everyone who kind of considers a holiday, they see it as like, I've got to go see something new, or I've got to go see something fascinating, and I've got to have exhilaration and fun, or get wasted, and that's a complete lie. It's different for everybody, but for me, a holiday is about a hard reboot. It's about getting away from everything which makes your life, and giving you the opportunity that you can sit back and say, you know what, today I don't have to do anything. I'll likely end up doing anything. I did a lot of things whilst I was away, but I don't have to, because it's a holiday. It's a separation from reality by being on holiday. And of course, when you come back, obviously, you get the obvious the follow-up depression of knowing that you're not on holiday anymore and you've got lots of things to do. But we'll get round that. That's how we live life. But back to the point, I went away on holiday. It was also the first trip I've taken alone outside of the country. I've been out of the country with people who I didn't choose to go on holiday due to business and various field trips, like school trips. But up till fairly recently, I was doing everything with my partner, and then I had a separation back in December 2016. So this was my first big trip on my own, and it was a fairly big thing for me. So I kind of set myself targets of going away and saying to myself that there's a few things which I need to do. There's a few things which I hugely enjoy, and there's a few things which I hugely enjoyed with my other half. And I need to make sure that those things haven't changed, that those things are still something which I can go out and do. And I did. And we're going to get to those things. So I went to Bruges. I don't know why I was in Bruges. This was a conversation I was expecting to have with people in Bruges. I went and expected someone to ask, why did you choose Bruges? Well, no one asked me why I chose Bruges. And I was waiting to have this conversation, which was along the lines of, I don't have any idea why I'm in Bruges. I'm basically here just out of coincidence and cost. Because it was fairly cheap, and I went on the Eurostar, first time on the Eurostar. If you're unaware, the Eurostar is a train which goes from London St Pancras International, takes you all the way through to France. So you can get there, you don't have to take a plane, you don't have to take a boat, you can just get on a train and go. Because they built a tunnel. Fantastic channel tunnel. Regardless of what xenophobes think, the channel tunnel is fantastic. It's a freaking hole under an ocean which humanity built. How can you question that as being a marvellous invention? Anyway, went to Bruges. And I ended up there out of coincidence because I'd been considering going to Berlin. Berlin's a great place. Been there before. Went for a week and really enjoyed it. It was a really good time. And then I realised that I might not be able to afford Berlin. And I was looking for cheaper alternatives, and Bruges came up. And I was umming and ahhing and discussing myself with Belgium. I've never been to Belgium. And I realised maybe I should go. And then I flicked on TV one night, and In Bruges was on, which is a great film. And it was a film which I saw whilst I was in university, and I thought it was hilarious. And that I'm not a person who believes in fate. I'm not a person who believes in that there is a place for everything and everything's perfect, and you got to take the symbols and the sign. There are no symbols and sign. You read into everything you want, and that comes from my art background. Everything can have context, and it's up to you to apply that context. So, you can't really get around that. So I kind of looked at it as, okay, this is hugely coincidental, but at the same time, for the first time, I'm going to take that coincidence, and I'm going to go out of my way and go to Bruges. So I did go to Bruges, and it was fantastic. It's a brilliant city. But whilst I was there, to the point of this actual podcast, whilst I ramble on telling you about my boring life. Boring life. I went to another country, Jesus. Anyway, I was in Bruges, and most of my time there, my guide to travelling, if anyone's going to travel, is that you get there, you spend as little as you can on food, and you spend all of your money on coffee and museums and sites. And that is how you travel. That's how I travel, is you get there, you spend too much money on museums and coffee, and that basically becomes your life. So that's what I did. I went out and I went to the various museums of Bruges. I took a day trip. I went to Ostend, which is just on the coast of Belgium. Excuse me. Just off the coast of Belgium. Just off the coast of Belgium. Just on the coast of Belgium, where they have a fantastic fine art museum. And yeah, that was basically how I spent my trip to Bruges. But a lot of it got me thinking, because it was interesting being a solo traveller in a museum. I've been to museums on my own before, and it's always an interesting experience. But whilst I was in these museums, I was surrounded by coach trips of older people and people from other cultures. But they were all arranged trips, and obviously they go to these sites, and the trips are all paid for, and they have this thing. Whereas I obviously chose that to go on my own, and it got me thinking about how we use art as an idea and the relation of art between people, because as a society, art has a very high place. And I watched a film the other night called Monuments Men. It has George Clooney, Matt Damon in it, Bill Murray. It's a great little film. It has its drawbacks as a film, but every film does. But the sentiment of the film was based on a true story of a group of people who were assembled in order to collect fine art pieces during World War II, to protect the cultural heritage of Europe whilst there was a war zone happening within Europe, within France, within Belgium, within all these places. So they arranged this group of people who went out and collected these paintings and protected them, and then handed them back to the countries once the war had ended. And that was the whole idea. And it was the fact that they were willing to sacrifice lives to save art, when in reality art is on the basest of levels, it's a sketch. It's a piece of sculpture, and yet we really heavily glorify art. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's a representation of human intelligence and imagination, which we find these masterpieces and we go, yes, that is the peak of that time, and that is a peak of an idea which connects people. And everyone gets something different when they look at art. Everyone looks at something and they go, something in their head clicks, and they try to interpret it, and they try to interpret art. And that, whilst in itself is a beautiful idea, is one which is the biggest problem for art. Because I really can't remember the name of it. I'll look it up as I say here. But I was in Bruges' Fine Art Museum, where they have all their classical paintings. Bruges Fine Art, excuse me. I am quickly looking this up. Bruges. There we go, the Groningen Museum. So there's a museum in Bruges called the Groningen Museum, and it holds a lot of the classical works which are developed by Belgian artists. Hugely stunning paintings. It's also connected to another gallery across the road called the Artenhaus, which again had a smaller exhibition on, but was worth going to see. But what was interesting about the Groningen Museum was that it had these huge romantic and classical Flemish paintings. But they also have a modern art exhibition on. And most of this modern art was single colour canvases. And whilst I was wandering around and I was surrounded by people of an older generation and people of other cultures, everyone was looking at these classical fine art paintings, and nobody was in the modern art section. I walked through and I spent time in there and had a sit and chilled out and just looked at these modern art paintings, and everyone avoided that room, as though it was something either not as important or unrelatable, or just that they didn't want to see it, that they felt like that was a waste of their money. And I found that really interesting because, I mean, obviously I go out of my way to see fine art, especially modern art. I go to museums, I take trips specifically to see modern artists because I'm from a fine art background. I think it's important to go look at work, regardless of whether I'm going to enjoy it or not, because it's that interpretation you get as you see it and as you experience it. And I think that's just me, and I understand that a lot of people don't understand that, and that's not their drive to get up and go see. And yet I was kind of sat there thinking, well, how does this kind of balance? And then in that sense, why are they here to see classical works? Are they here to see classical works because they feel that that's an important thing to do? Because they feel like that's something they have to do because they're in the city, in the same way as like you go to, as they say in Rome, do as the Romans do. If you're in another country, you have to go experience their culture, and they didn't feel that modern art was part of their culture. They only wanted the historical culture. It's an interesting balance to kind of strike between what you're doing out of what you feel is your responsibility, or what you're doing for the distinction, to say that, you know, I've been seeing this, I've been seeing a Rembrandt, and I've been to see, you know, Rembrandt's house, and I've been to Anne Frank's house because, you know, it's an important historical thing, or whether you're doing it because you truly want to understand the art, that you truly want to step into a room and experience those paintings. When you're experiencing those paintings, obviously it's a balance between your mind and your logic telling you what you see. And that's the reason why I don't take gallery tours, because I want to experience paintings the same way, or as close to as I can, as when those paintings were created. Obviously there's a whole context in the back of my mind, because I've had a completely different upbringing to the time when a painting was made, in like 19th century neoclassical. But all I want is the title and the image, and a little bit of background about the artist. And I want to look at that painting and think, what did the people of that time think? And then how do I look at this and think, yeah, that's how I discern in my head whether something is good or bad within the art world. And good and bad is completely subjective. That's just the basis of art itself. And I kind of have to sit there and think, yeah, well, but those people aren't giving the time of day to this main thing, to this modern thing. How can you sit there and go, yeah, this painting's worth it and this painting's not? You can't. So I think that's an important idea of, if you're visiting a gallery, is just don't just go see the Mona Lisa. Go see the rest of the gallery. Because everything in there, whether you like it or not, I'm not saying you have to spend your whole day looking at things you don't like. I'm just saying, give it a chance. Go experience it. Go experience it in the same way you would the Mona Lisa. Go experience it in the same way you would go see a Rembrandt painting. Because that's what they're put there. That's why art is put into galleries, is for you to consider it. It is put there for you to sit back and think to yourself, yeah, or no. But that's the balance. That's what I'm trying to, I mean, in a way, I'm trying to manage within myself of how we use art. I use art. It was a conversation which I had myself to kind of break. It started with an idea of how we use music and how we use film. Excuse me. Obviously, these are ideas and these are creations which we then take upon ourselves. We inflict our own ideas, own context into those songs and films, and we relate to them as narrative story, regardless of whether it's narrative story or not, and the emotions which are felt within those. And we try and relate, or we don't relate. And part of that informs how you interpret it. So you hear a song and you think to yourself, what is this song about? Can I relate to this song? And you may not relate to this song, but you may still think it's a good song because you may think it's technically good. But if you connect with it, then obviously you're going to appreciate that song a little bit more, or you're going to not appreciate that song a little bit more. Maybe you'll resent that song because it tells you something about yourself which you didn't know. And I think art has along those lines. For me, personally, I looked at art as somewhere to disconnect from my own brain. I looked at it as something which is going to make me think or feel in some way. It's going to open a discussion within myself. And that's what I do when I create work. I want to make work which allows people to have a discussion with themselves and the world around them. If they want to take it to the world around them, fantastic, because then that's even had more of an impact than anything else. And I think that's what's important for art to do. It is important for you to sit there and look at it and make a connection with it. And that is the main barrier for modern art, is that a lot of people, they can't connect with modern art, and they only see modern art as something for scholars and, the pretentious level which fine art can get to. And everything has a pretentious level, regardless of whether you think it does or not. I mean, even food has a pretentious level. If you're eating the wrong kind of caviar with the wrong kind of wine, God forbid. But fine art has this barrier which is well and truly fully constructed. It's a wall which is incredibly hard to find a gap in, and you kind of have to force yourself at times through that wall to see what's on the other side. And if you're not a person who follows art, I can completely understand if you don't want to do that. If you don't want to spend your time looking into that and exploring that, that is completely acceptable. In the same way that I don't want to spend time looking into something which doesn't interest me. I am not going to look into the history and the conceptual meaning and the challenges overcome by a football team. That's just not going to happen because I don't have that interest, and there's no middle ground for me to connect with that. For most people, the middle ground there comes from patriotism, and that's a whole other conversation. But it's something I just don't have, so I can understand how people have that with fine art. And I find it interesting that a lot of people disregard a lot of art, but they know of it. Because in a way, they're kind of unaware that they've been affected by it. I mean, there's a couple of famous pieces, for instance, Tracey Emin's Unmade Bed, and Duchamp's Mutt, his urinal, which cracked into a gallery. Those are two pieces which, if you discuss modern art, will come up. Damien Hirst, chopping animals in half, putting them in display cases. Those are pieces which are hugely impactful, to the point of people say they don't like them and they dislike them, and that's not art, and how is that art, and how is this even a consideration for being art when it's not stunning, it's not something to look at, and yet they're talking about it. It's caused discussion, which is what art is to me. It's something which needs to get out there and cause a discussion, or make you just consider your surroundings and context. And that's what they do. That's what those pieces of art do. I mean, I'm not a follower of any of those artists, and yet I'm aware of those pieces. I think the closest out of those three is Damien Hirst, and that's because I did a lot of interest in him when I was in college. And yet we're kind of sat there and saying, yeah, you can mention those pieces to anyone, and they'll likely know who they are. And that's true impact from art. And I think a lot of really fine art, it lacks that connection because it's not rememberable to someone who is not following art. And I think art should be accessible to everyone. A really an interesting one when I went to Ostend, because whilst I go to these big galleries, I also go to smaller ones. For instance, I went to the Picasso Museum, which wasn't a Picasso museum, but more of like a collection of his sketches and work which he had done outside of the painting, so a little bit of his ceramic work, which is a lot lesser known. I also went to the Dali Museum, which is in central Bruges, and I visit these places because I'm interested about, obviously from my background, I'm interested about the artists and I'm interested about their lives and how they got to where they were. And learning about these artists, learning about what these people who are considered masters was really interesting, because it helps give you a little bit of reflection. I mean, my full scale dream is still to be an artist. I have no idea if I'll get there. But then neither did Salvador Dali, neither did Pablo Picasso. And whilst I find it hard with those two especially to look at that and think, well, maybe there's a slight chance for me, because they created work for different reasons. I mean, Dali created work to create work. There was a great piece, great quote written on the wall of the Dali Museum, which is something along the lines of, just because I don't know what I'm creating whilst I'm creating it doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning at the end of it. And I thought that's fantastic. You are creating for the act of creating, and obviously he had a huge influence within the Surrealist movement, and that was a whole idea. And for my generation, and for the world we live in right now, it's hard to find those movements because they're not publicized. They're not things which you know about whilst they're happening. They just happen, and then all of a sudden, 10 years later, they're doing a museum based on that whole movement, which was whatever was happening at the time. But the reason I mentioned that is I went to Musée in Ostend, which is a modern art museum, and there was a exhibition on there, which I'm trying to remember his name, by Frans Masriel. Or Masriel. I'm not terribly great at pronouncing names. But Frans Masriel, who... The exhibition was called Images of Resistance. It was great, fantastic exhibition. I think it was one of the best ones which I saw whilst I was in Bruges. And he was a graphic artist and woodcutter within the 20th century. And he basically created work just to express his ideas, to push those ideas into the world. And that is, I related a lot to that as someone who likes to create, wanting to develop discussion. And whilst Picasso and Dali had these works, and it seemed a kind of a balance between the two. You had these two grandmasters who were making work, and obviously it was interesting to see that the Dali Museum, you could purchase works, and obviously they were expensive, and I saw a couple of people purchasing these works, and I was like thinking to myself, whilst I'd love to own those images, owning the original isn't important to me, because the idea of the image is important to me, not owning the original. And when I went to see Masriel's work, it was interesting to read about how he'd gone about pushing that work into the world. Instead of creating kind of masterpieces, instead of creating fine art icons, he'd instead approached graphic design and made comics for magazines and sartorial things, and all with the intention of just getting his work to as many people as possible. That was kind of the key to the work he was creating. He wanted to make things from kind of a constructive standpoint and question injustice and inequality with a critical eye, and in order to get that idea, which he felt was important, into the world. And that's kind of like a path, that's basically a path which I'd love to follow. And so it's very much a form of expression, and when I go to see artwork and look at artwork, I'm looking for someone else's expression. I'm looking not necessarily to have someone agree with me. I'm never looking for something to say, yes, this is in a way, I hate it when that happens, because in my mind I'm like, well, I can never create work about it because somebody else has already done it. And it's a terrible attitude to have. But at the same time, I'm kind of thinking, I'm just looking for opinion. I'm looking for expression and intellectual inspiration in order to, not to inform what I'm doing, but just to have that discussion. And that's what I approach art for. And I think a lot of people within the world who obviously aren't from an art background, because a lot of people aren't from an art background. That's something to remember, artists, that people aren't from art backgrounds. We chose to look at this in the same way an engineer choose to explore engineering. They understand that not everyone's an engineer. But I think a lot of people will go see fine art, and you've got to consider the reasons they're going to see it. And you've got to be able to connect with all of those people. And trying to find that balance is incredibly hard. Trying to find a way to make something which not only demonstrates your idea in a manner which is interpretable at a high level, but also connects enough with people who aren't there for the high level, enough for them to remember it and generate discussion between them, and maybe have them go and research it, and maybe have them go and look into what you've been doing. On another level, that's an incredible boundary to try and straddle. I don't even know where to end with that. That is the challenge of art, and I think a lot of people miss that point, especially artists. I think a lot of people miss that point of, you've got to try and communicate, because you can create pieces, and you can create pieces to the end of your life, but whether those pieces communicate with the world, that's a hard thing to kind of aspire to. But I want people to consider how they use art. I want people to consider how they look at the world and how they view art. And consider why they're going to see art. If you're going to see art, I think you should give it its time. I think you should consider the impact you're having on viewing that work as much as that work is having on you. And never go see art just for the technical ability. Go see it because it's technically ability and because of the concept. And I think I'll leave you with that thought. I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks for listening.